In a small village nestled in the heart of Africa, there lived a young girl named Blessing. She was a bright and ambitious student, loved by all who knew her. Blessing's parents were divorced, and she lived with her mother, who worked tirelessly to provide for her daughter's needs. However, due to her mother's busy schedule, Blessing often found herself staying at her uncle's house after school. Blessing's uncle, Uncle Kofi, was a well-respected member of the community. He was a successful businessman and always ready to lend a helping hand. Or so it seemed. Behind closed doors, Uncle Kofi had a dark secret. He had been molesting Blessing for months, taking advantage of her innocence and trust. Blessing tried to avoid her uncle as much as possible, but it seemed like the more she tried to stay away, the more he wanted her around. She felt trapped and alone, with no one to turn to. One day, Blessing mustered up the courage to tell her mother about the abuse. But her mother was too busy, too distracted, and too caught up in her own problems to listen. "Blessing, I don't have time for this right now," her mother said, waving her hand dismissively. "You're just being paranoid. Uncle Kofi would never do such a thing." Blessing felt a knot in her stomach as she watched her mother walk away, leaving her feeling unheard and unseen. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Blessing's grades began to slip, and her once bright and ambitious spirit began to fade. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of despair, with no lifeline in sight. Her school teacher, Mrs. Okoro, noticed the change in Blessing and decided to investigate. She called Blessing to her office one day after school and asked her what was wrong. Blessing hesitated at first, but something about Mrs. Okoro's kind and gentle demeanor put her at ease. "I'll tell you, Mrs. Okoro," Blessing said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you have to promise not to tell anyone." Mrs. Okoro nodded, her eyes filled with compassion and understanding. And with that, Blessing began to tell her story. Blessing's words poured out like a river, as she told Mrs. Okoro about the abuse she had suffered at the hands of her uncle. Mrs. Okoro listened attentively, her expression a mix of shock, sadness, and compassion. As Blessing spoke, she felt a weight lifting off her shoulders, as if she had finally found someone who understood her pain. Mrs. Okoro's office was a safe space, filled with the warm scent of old books and the comforting hum of the air conditioner. Blessing felt like she could breathe again, like she had finally found a refuge from the storm that had been raging inside her. As she finished her story, Mrs. Okoro took her hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "I'm so sorry, Blessing," Mrs. Okoro said, her voice filled with emotion. "No one deserves to go through what you've been through. But I want you to know that you're not alone. I'm here for you, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure you're safe." Blessing felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at Mrs. Okoro, her eyes welling up with tears. For the first time in months, Blessing felt like she could cry, like she could finally release the pent-up emotions that had been bottled up inside her. Mrs. Okoro handed her a tissue, and Blessing wiped away her tears, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. As they sat there in silence, Blessing realized that she had been carrying the weight of secrecy for far too long. She had been shouldering the burden of her uncle's abuse, afraid to speak out, afraid of being rejected or ridiculed. But now, with Mrs. Okoro by her side, she felt like she could finally share that burden, like she could finally begin to heal. But as they sat there, Blessing's mind began to wander, thinking about the consequences of speaking out. What would happen to her uncle? Would her mother believe her? Would she be ostracized by her community? The question swirled in her head, making her feel anxious and uncertain. Mrs. Okoro seemed to sense her unease, and she gave Blessing's hand a reassuring squeeze. "We'll face this together, Blessing," she said. "You're not alone. We'll get through this, one step at a time." Mrs. Okoro's words of reassurance echoed in Blessing's mind as she walked home from school that day. She felt a sense of hope that she hadn't felt in months, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she could finally escape the nightmare that had been her life. But as she approached her house, Blessing's anxiety began to creep back in. She knew that she would have to face her mother eventually, and she wasn't sure if she was ready. Her mother had always been dismissive of her concerns, and Blessing worried that she would react the same way this time. As she entered the house, Blessing's mother looked up from her cooking, a look of expectation on her face. "How was your day, Blessing?" she asked, but Blessing just shrugged, not knowing how to respond. She knew that she couldn't keep her secret hidden forever, but she was scared of the consequences of speaking out. What if her mother didn't believe her? What if she got angry? Blessing felt like she was trapped between a rock and a hard place, unsure of what to do. As she stood there, frozen with indecision, Blessing's mother noticed that something was wrong. "Blessing, what's going on?" she asked, her voice softer now. "You can tell me anything." Blessing hesitated, unsure if she should trust her mother. But something about her mother's tone put her at ease, and she decided to take a chance. "Mommy, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something that's been going on for a while now." Her mother's expression changed, a look of concern etched on her face. "What is it, Blessing?" she asked, her voice urgent now. Blessing took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. Blessing's mother listened in stunned silence as her daughter recounted the abuse she had suffered at the hands of Uncle Kofi. Her expression changed from concern to shock to outrage, her eyes welling up with tears. As Blessing finished speaking, her mother pulled her into a tight hug, holding her close as if she would never let her go. "I'm so sorry, Blessing," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "I'm so sorry I didn't listen to you before. I'm so sorry I didn't protect you." Blessing felt a wave of relief wash over her as she hugged her mother back. She had been so scared of how her mother would react, but now she felt like she had finally found a safe haven. Her mother pulled back and looked her in the eye. "We will report this to the authorities," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "We will make sure Uncle Kofi pays for what he has done." Blessing felt a sense of justice rising up inside her. She had been silent for so long, but now she felt like she had found her voice. She nodded in agreement, feeling a sense of determination wash over her. Together, Blessing and her mother went to the police station and filed a report. Blessing's mother held her hand the entire time, offering her support and comfort. As they left the police station, Blessing felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew that she was not alone. Her mother turned to her and smiled. "We will get through this together, Blessing," she said. "You are strong and brave, and I am so proud of you." Blessing smiled back, feeling a sense of gratitude towards her mother. She knew that she still had a long way to go, but for the first time in months, she felt like she could finally start to heal. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Blessing's uncle was arrested and charged with child molestation. Blessing and her mother went to court to testify against him. Blessing's mother was a rock, supporting her every step of the way. She accompanied Blessing to counseling sessions, helped her with her homework, and even attended parent-teacher conferences. As the trial approached, Blessing's anxiety grew. She was scared of facing her uncle in court, of reliving the trauma she had experienced. But with her mother by her side, she felt like she could face anything. The day of the trial arrived, and Blessing's mother took her to the courthouse. Blessing was nervous, but she steeled herself for what was to come. As they entered the courtroom, Blessing saw her uncle sitting in the defendant's chair. He looked smug and confident, but Blessing knew the truth. She knew that he was a monster, and she was determined to make sure he paid for his crimes. The trial was a blur, but Blessing remembered every detail. She remembered the way her uncle's lawyer tried to trip her up, the way the prosecutor questioned her. But most of all, she remembered the way her mother supported her, the way she held her hand and told her everything would be okay. In the end, the verdict was guilty. Blessing's uncle was sentenced to life in prison, and Blessing felt a sense of closure wash over her. She knew that she still had a long way to go, but she also knew that she was on the path to healing. As they left the courtroom, Blessing's mother hugged her tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Blessing," she said. "You're strong and brave, and you deserve all the happiness in the world." Blessing smiled, feeling a sense of gratitude towards her mother. She knew that she couldn't have made it through this ordeal without her. The verdict was a turning point for Blessing. She finally felt like she could begin to heal, like she could start to put the pieces of her life back together. With her mother's support, Blessing started attending therapy sessions. She talked to a kind and compassionate counselor who helped her work through her feelings. At first, it was hard for Blessing to open up. She had bottled up her emotions for so long that it was difficult to let them out. But with time and patience, she began to feel more comfortable sharing her thoughts and feelings. The therapy sessions were a safe space for Blessing to express herself. She could talk about her feelings without fear of judgment or rejection. And with each session, she felt like she was getting closer to healing. Blessing's mother was also a source of comfort and support. She attended therapy sessions with Blessing, and she was always there to listen and offer words of encouragement. As the weeks turned into months, Blessing started to feel like herself again. She began to enjoy activities she had previously avoided, like playing with her friends and going to school. Her grades began to improve, and she even started to make new friends. Blessing realized that she didn't have to be defined by her past. She could create a new future for herself, one that was filled with hope and possibility. One day, Blessing's therapist asked her to write a letter to her uncle. It was a therapeutic exercise, designed to help Blessing process her emotions. At first, Blessing was hesitant. She didn't want to think about her uncle, let alone write to him. But with some encouragement from her therapist, she decided to give it a try. As she sat down to write, Blessing felt a mix of emotions. She was angry, sad, and hurt. But as she began to write, she felt a sense of catharsis wash over her. Blessing's pen moved swiftly across the page as she poured out her emotions onto the paper. She wrote about the pain and the fear she had felt, about the way her uncle had betrayed her trust. As she wrote, Blessing felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. She was finally able to express the emotions she had bottled up for so long. When she finished writing, Blessing read over her letter, tears streaming down her face. It was a raw and honest account of her experiences, a testament to the strength and resilience she had shown in the face of adversity. Blessing's therapist read the letter too, a look of pride and admiration on her face. "You're so brave, Blessing," she said. "This takes a lot of courage." Blessing smiled, feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment. She knew that she still had a long way to go, but she also knew that she was on the right path. The letter was not just a therapeutic exercise, it was also a declaration of truth. Blessing was finally able to confront her uncle's actions, to acknowledge the pain he had caused her. As she looked at the letter, Blessing felt a sense of closure. She knew that she would never forget what had happened, but she also knew that she didn't have to let it define her. She was more than a victim, she was a survivor. And with this letter, she was taking back control of her life, reclaiming her voice and her story. Blessing's therapist smiled at her, a look of pride and admiration on her face. "You're doing great, Blessing," she said. "Keep moving forward." As the days turned into weeks, Blessing began to feel like herself again. She was healing, slowly but surely, and she was determined to make the most of her newfound freedom. With her mother's support, Blessing started to re-engage in activities she had previously enjoyed. She joined a local art club, where she discovered a talent for painting. She also started playing soccer again, something she had loved doing before her uncle's abuse. Blessing's mother was overjoyed to see her daughter thriving again. She attended every one of Blessing's soccer games, cheering her on from the sidelines. As Blessing looked out at the soccer field, she felt a sense of joy and freedom that she hadn't felt in years. She was finally able to be herself again, without the weight of her uncle's abuse holding her back. After the game, Blessing's mother hugged her tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Blessing," she said. "You're an amazing young woman." Blessing smiled, feeling happy and content. She knew that she still had challenges ahead of her, but she was ready to face them head-on. As they walked off the field, Blessing's mother turned to her with a serious expression. "Blessing, I want to apologize again for not believing you when you first told me about your uncle," she said. "I was wrong, and I'm so sorry." Blessing looked at her mother, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. "It's okay, Mommy," she said. "I know you didn't mean to hurt me." Her mother smiled, relief written all over her face. "Thank you, Blessing," she said. "I promise to always be there for you, no matter what." As Blessing looked back on her journey, she realized that she had learned a valuable lesson. She had learned that silence was not always the best option, that speaking out and seeking help was often the bravest and most powerful thing to do. Blessing's story spread like wildfire through her community, inspiring others to speak out against abuse and injustice. She became a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always a way forward. Blessing's mother also learned a valuable lesson. She realized that as a parent, it was her responsibility to listen to her child, to believe her and support her, no matter what. As they sat on the couch together, Blessing turned to her mother with a smile. "Thank you, Mommy," she said. "Thank you for being there for me." Her mother hugged her tightly. "I'll always be here for you, Blessing," she said. "I promise." And as they hugged, Blessing knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She was safe, she was loved, and she was free. Speaking out against abuse and injustice reminds us that silence is not always the best option, and that seeking help and support is often the bravest and most powerful thing to do. Make sure to listen and believe your children, especially when they are trying to tell us something difficult or uncomfortable, no matter what.